Subjective intent to treat someone unequally is not required to prove racial discrimination. Rather than merely searching for direct evidence of overt racist statements or actions, we all must consider whether there's circumstantial evidence of racial discrimination. Based on these points, on these principles, I outlined in my report for analyzing racial discrimination, I found that in my review of cases, Thunder Bay Police Service investigators, they failed on an unacceptably high number of occasions to treat or protect the deceased and his or her family equally and without discrimination because the deceased was indigenous. Investigators too readily presumed accident in cases of indigenous sudden deaths. They relied upon evidence of drowning or hypothermia as if it virtually determined that the death was accidental. They placed extraordinary weight on the deceased's level of intoxication as if it virtually determined that the death was accidental. They failed to take even the most basic investigative steps in a number of sudden death cases. They ignored evidence potentially pointing to a non-accidental cause or contribution to the death. Some attempts to explain the deficiencies in the investigation by references, some attempted to explain the deficiencies in the investigations by reflecting and referencing their workload as well as a lack of training and resources. In my view, these explanations cannot fully account for the failings that my team and I observed given their nature and severity. The failure to conduct adequate investigations and the premature conclusions drawn in these cases, at least in part, attributed to racial stereotyping. Racial stereotyping involves transforming individual experiences into generalized assumptions about an identifying group defined by race. We observed this process of generalization based on race in a number of the investigations we reviewed. Officers repeatedly relied on generalized notions about how indigenous people likely came to their deaths and acted or refrained from acting based on those biases. This does not represent a determination that all Thunder Bay Police Service officers engaged in intentional racism, no. However, the fact remains that investigations were too often handled differently because the deceased was indigenous. As I indicated earlier, I also examined the issue of racism more broadly. That is, beyond how sudden death investigations were conducted. In this regard, we conducted 36 interviews with Thunder Bay Service members in the course of our review. We encountered a wide range of beliefs and attitudes. Some expressed very disturbing views. While these views were expressed by a minority of officers, they were expressed by more than just a bad few apples. We also heard from both indigenous and non-indigenous community members who described troubling attitudes, statements, and actions by officers. Overall, I found that systemic racism exists in Thunder Bay Police Service at an institutional level.